Sarah Martinez pushed her cleaning cart through the polished corridors of Fort Blackstone at 4:47 a.m., her worn sneakers silent against the gleaming linoleum. The sprawling military installation hummed with pre-dawn activity as she navigated between early shift personnel who barely acknowledged her presence. Her gray uniform bore the simple embroidered name, S. Martinez, and a contractor badge that granted her access to most areas of the base, though few bothered to read it closely enough to notice the unusual security clearance level embedded in its digital coding. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed because tomorrow, I've saved something extra special for you. The massive facility stretched across 12,000 acres of Colorado terrain, housing 3 specialized training divisions and serving as headquarters for the Mountain Warfare Command. Sarah had been assigned here through what her handler described as administrative placement, a deliberately vague term that masked the true nature of her mission. 6 months ago, she had been leading classified operations in hostile territory. Now, after an incident that remained buried under layers of redacted documentation, she found herself mopping floors and emptying trash cans while conducting the most important surveillance of her career. Her cleaning cart rattled softly as she turned into the administrative wing, where fluorescent lights cast harsh shadows across motivational posters and official photographs. The base's commanding officer, General Patricia Hawkins, smiled from a frame near the reception desk, her dress uniform immaculate and her expression radiating the confidence of someone who had never questioned the systems under her command. Sarah paused momentarily, adjusting her grip on the mop handle as she studied the photo. With the practiced eye of someone trained to assess potential threats and weaknesses, the early morning shift brought its own rhythm to Fort Blackstone. Kitchen staff prepared breakfast in the central mess hall while security personnel conducted perimeter checks and administrative clerks processed overnight communications. Sarah moved through this controlled chaos with deliberate invisibility. Her presence so thoroughly unremarkable that conversations continued around her as if she were merely another piece of equipment. This anonymity was precisely what made her so effective at her true purpose. Lieutenant Colonel James Bradley strode past her position near the water fountain, his polished boots clicking against the floor as he spoke into his secure phone. "The inspection team arrives Thursday," he said, his voice carrying the tension of someone under significant pressure. "Everything needs to be perfect. No questions, no complications, no surprises." He disappeared around the corner without glancing at the woman methodically cleaning the area where he had just revealed critical information about an upcoming event that wasn't supposed to be public knowledge. Sarah's background made her uniquely qualified for this assignment, though none of her current colleagues would suspect the truth. Born in Denver to a family with 3 generations of military service, she had enlisted immediately after high school, driven by a combination of patriotic duty and personal challenge that had defined her entire adult life. Her exceptional performance during basic training had caught the attention of special operations recruiters, leading to a career path that few women had successfully navigated in the early 2000s. The Navy SEAL training pipeline had nearly broken her twice. First during Hell Week, when hypothermia and exhaustion pushed her beyond what she had believed were her physical limits. Second during the advanced combat diving phase, when a training accident had left her unconscious underwater for nearly 3 minutes. Both times, she had refused medical withdrawal, driven by a determination that her instructors later described as unprecedented and slightly terrifying in their official evaluations. 12 years of active duty had taken her to places that remained classified in operations that existed only in heavily redacted files. She had trained local forces in counterterrorism, conducted reconnaissance missions in denied territory, and participated in hostage rescue operations that required split-second decisions under extreme pressure. Her service record, what remained visible of it, showed commendations for valor, tactical innovation, and leadership under fire. The incident that had ended her conventional military career remained officially classified. But Sarah remembered every detail with crystalline clarity. A joint operation in Syria had gone catastrophically wrong when intelligence failures in communication breakdowns had led to civilian casualties. The subsequent investigation had focused more on finding scapegoats than identifying systemic problems, and Sarah's refusal to accept responsibility for failures beyond her control had made her a liability to commanding officers seeking simple explanations for complex disasters. Her transition to defense intelligence work had been presented as a lateral move, but she understood the reality. She was being utilized for assignments that required her unique skill set while being kept at arm's length from conventional military structures. The Department of Defense had discovered that her combination of special operations training and analytical intelligence made her invaluable for situations where traditional approaches had failed. Fort Blackstone represented exactly such a situation. Over the past 8 months, the base had reported a series of concerning incidents that individually appeared minor but collectively suggested deeper problems. Training accidents had increased by 300%. Equipment failures during exercises had become routine. Most troubling, 3 separate whistleblower complaints had been filed alleging systematic cover-ups of safety violations, only to have the complainants mysteriously transferred to different assignments before investigations could be completed. Sarah's official assignment was facilities maintenance, a position that provided unrestricted access to virtually every area of the base while maintaining the perfect cover for intelligence gathering. Her work orders took her through command centers, training facilities, barracks, and administrative offices, allowing her to observe personnel interactions and document irregularities that would be invisible to traditional oversight mechanisms. The morning briefing room buzzed with activity as Sarah entered to empty trash containers and replace air fresheners. Major Robert Chun stood at the front of the room, gesturing toward a tactical display showing the base's training ranges. His audience consisted of junior officers and senior enlisted personnel, all focused intently on the presentation about upcoming exercises. Sarah moved methodically around the room's perimeter, her movements deliberately unobtrusive while her trained ear cataloged every detail of the discussion. "The Mountain Warfare Assessment begins Monday," Major Chun announced, manipulating the digital display to show terrain features and tactical objectives. "Congressional observers will be present to evaluate our readiness for deployment to similar environments overseas. Unit performance during this exercise will directly impact future funding and operational assignments." Sarah paused near the waste container beside Chun's podium, ostensibly checking its contents while noting the subtle tension in his voice. The exercise he was describing differed significantly from the training schedules she had observed during her previous weeks at the base. Equipment lists had been modified, safety protocols had been abbreviated, and most concerning, the medical support arrangements seemed insufficient for the scale of operations being planned. Captain Lisa Rodriguez raised her hand from the third row. "Sir, the equipment requisition forms show significant shortages in cold weather gear. How do we address protective equipment deficiencies during mountain operations?" Her question carried the professional concern of an officer who prioritized soldier welfare over administrative convenience. Chun's expression tightened almost imperceptibly. "Requisitions are being processed through appropriate channels. Focus on training readiness rather than equipment concerns. The assessment parameters have been established at division level and are not subject to field modification." Sarah continued her cleaning routine while mentally cataloging the exchange. Rodriguez's question had touched on a recurring theme she had observed throughout her time at Fort Blackstone: systematic pressure to proceed with operations despite inadequate preparation or resources. The pattern suggested institutional priorities that placed public perception and bureaucratic Advancement above the fundamental military principle of never sending soldiers into situations where they were inadequately prepared for success. Meeting concluded with standard dismissal procedures, but Sarah lingered near the rear exit, adjusting cleaning supplies while observing the informal conversations that followed formal briefings. These unguarded moments often revealed information that carefully structured presentations deliberately obscured. Lieutenant David Park approached Major Chun near the podium, his voice lowered to avoid being overheard by departing personnel. "Sir, the medical readiness reports still show concerns about evacuation procedures from the high-altitude training area. If we have casualties during the assessment, response times could exceed acceptable parameters." Chun glanced around the room, ensuring their conversation remained private. He failed to notice Sarah methodically wiping down tables within earshot. "Park, the assessment schedule is non-negotiable. The division has made it clear that any delays or complications will reflect poorly on this base's leadership. Focus on executing the mission as planned rather than identifying potential problems." The exchange confirmed Sarah's growing suspicions about the institutional culture at Fort Blackstone. The upcoming assessment wasn't just another training exercise. It was a high-stakes evaluation that would determine the base's future funding and operational assignments. The pressure to succeed had created an environment where legitimate safety concerns were being dismissed or ignored in favor of maintaining appearance of readiness. After the officers departed, Sarah completed her cleaning tasks with the same methodical precision she had applied to military operations throughout her career. Her training had taught her that success in hostile environments required attention to seemingly insignificant details, and she applied that principle to her current assignment. Every overheard conversation, every modified procedure, every equipment shortage was documented in her secure digital notebook and transmitted to her handler through encrypted channels. The base's central commissary provided her next opportunity for observation. The facility served as an informal gathering place where personnel from different units interacted outside their formal command structures. Sarah positioned herself near the coffee station, ostensibly restocking supplies while monitoring conversations. At nearby tables, a group of senior non-commissioned officers occupied the corner booth, their discussion animated by frustration and professional concern. Staff Sergeant Maria Santos leaned forward, her voice carrying the authority of someone with extensive field experience. "The gear they're issuing for next week's exercise is completely inadequate for high-altitude operations. Half the cold weather equipment hasn't been properly maintained, and the communication systems are using outdated encryption protocols." Master Sergeant Kevin Walsh nodded grimly. "I've been trying to get updated equipment authorizations for 3 weeks. Every request gets bounced back with budget constraints or administrative delays. Meanwhile, we're expected to conduct realistic training with equipment that wouldn't pass inspection in a reserve unit." Sarah refilled the coffee station's supply containers with practiced efficiency while processing the implications of their conversation. The equipment deficiencies they described weren't simply administrative inconveniences. They were potentially life-threatening gaps in soldier protection and operational capability. Her special operations background had taught her to recognize the difference between acceptable risk and negligent endangerment. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. The conversation continued as Santos pulled out a tablet showing maintenance reports. "Look at these inspection records. The high-altitude communication systems show multiple failures during recent exercises. In a real emergency, we'd be operating blind with no way to coordinate evacuation or support." Walsh's expression darkened. "Command knows about these issues. I've briefed them twice in the past month. The response is always the same: make do with available resources and focus on training objectives rather than equipment concerns. They're more worried about how things look to the congressional observers than whether soldiers have what they need to operate safely. Sarah moved to the adjacent table, wiping down surfaces while maintaining her cover as routine maintenance staff. Her training had taught her to blend into any environment, becoming so unremarkable that people forgot she was present. The skill had served her well during reconnaissance missions in hostile territory, and it proved equally valuable in gathering intelligence within her own military structure. The commissary's atmosphere reflected the broader tension she had observed. Throughout Fort Blackstone, personnel at every level seemed to understand that the upcoming assessment carried unusual significance, but the institutional response had been to increase pressure rather than address the fundamental problems that created risk. It was a pattern Sarah had witnessed in other organizations where appearances had become more important than substance. Her afternoon assignment took her to the base's main training facility, where she observed advanced combat exercises designed to prepare soldiers for the congressional assessment. The facility's observation deck provided an excellent vantage point for monitoring training procedures. While maintaining her cover as custodial staff, Captain Rodriguez led her unit through urban combat scenarios, her commands crisp and professional as soldiers navigated complex tactical situations. Sarah watched with the analytical eye of someone who had participated in similar exercises under actual combat conditions, noting both the impressive skill levels and the systematic shortcuts that compromised realistic preparation. The training ammunition was clearly insufficient for proper familiarization with weapon systems. Soldiers were executing complex maneuvers with equipment they had limited opportunity to use under realistic conditions. Most concerning, the medical support during exercises appeared to be configured for demonstration rather than actual emergency response. Colonel Bradley entered the observation area, his presence immediately commanding attention from the junior officers monitoring the exercise. His uniform was immaculate, his bearing confident, but Sarah detected the subtle stress indicators that suggested someone operating under significant pressure. "How are the preparations proceeding?" Bradley asked the senior instructor, his tone carrying the weight of someone whose career depended on the answer. "Training scores are excellent, sir," the instructor replied, gesturing toward the displays, showing unit performance metrics. "The soldiers are demonstrating high proficiency in all measured categories." Bradley studied the data, his expression revealing nothing of his thoughts. "And equipment readiness?" A brief pause followed the question, subtle but significant. "All equipment has been inspected and certified for the assessment, sir. Any minor issues are being addressed through standard maintenance procedures." Sarah continued her routine cleaning while noting the careful phrasing of both question and answer. Neither officer was asking or answering the fundamental question of whether soldiers had adequate equipment for safe operations. Instead, they were confirming that administrative requirements had been met and that documentation existed to support their decisions. The pattern had become unmistakable throughout her weeks at Fort Blackstone. The base was preparing for an assessment that would determine its future, but the preparation focused on creating the appearance of readiness rather than ensuring actual operational capability. Equipment shortages were being minimized, safety concerns were being dismissed, and personnel who raised questions were being marginalized or transferred. Her secure communication device vibrated softly against her wrist as she worked, indicating a message from her handler. The encrypted text was brief. "Assessment moved up 72 hours. Expedite intelligence gathering. The situation may be more urgent than originally assessed." Sarah's pulse quickened as she processed the implications. The congressional assessment that had already been creating pressure throughout the base was being accelerated, which meant even less time to address the systematic problems she had been documenting. The acceleration also suggested that higher-level political or military considerations were driving the timeline, potentially creating additional pressure for successful completion. Regardless of actual readiness, she completed her assigned tasks with the same methodical precision that had characterized her entire assignment, but her mind was already shifting to the next phase of her mission. The intelligence she had gathered painted a clear picture of an organization prioritizing appearance over substance, but she needed more specific evidence to support the kind of intervention that could prevent disaster. The evening shift brought different opportunities for observation. As daylight faded across the Colorado landscape, Fort Blackstone's nighttime protocols revealed aspects of the base's operations that remained hidden during normal duty hours. Sarah's maintenance assignments during this period took her through areas where security was reduced and conversations were more candid. The motor pool facility hummed with activity as mechanics worked to prepare vehicles for the upcoming exercises. Sarah entered to service the building's waste management systems, positioning herself near workstations, where technical personnel discussed equipment status with the frankness that characterized off-duty conversations. Sergeant First Class Tony Hernandez stood beside a partially disassembled communications vehicle, his expression reflecting the frustration of a skilled technician forced to work with inadequate resources. "This encryption system hasn't been updated since 2018, he said to his colleague, gesturing toward the exposed electronics. "We're supposed to demonstrate cutting-edge communication capabilities with equipment that's 2 generations obsolete." Specialist Jennifer Kim nodded while reviewing diagnostic reports on her tablet. "The high-altitude relay systems are even worse. Half the components show stress fractures from repeated use without proper maintenance intervals. If we lose communication during the mountain exercise, soldiers could be stranded without any way to call for support." Sarah moved methodically around the facility, her trained eye cataloging not just what she heard, but what she observed. The maintenance log showed patterns of deferred repairs, substituted components, and abbreviated testing procedures that would have been completely unacceptable in the special operations units where she had served. Her background had taught her to recognize the difference between acceptable risk and negligent endangerment. Every military operation involved calculated risks, but those calculations required honest assessment of capabilities and limitations. What she was observing at Fort Blackstone suggested systematic dishonesty about operational readiness, with potential consequences that extended far beyond the immediate assessment. The conversation between Hernandez and Kim continued as they worked, their voices carrying the professional concern of experienced soldiers who understood the life-and-death implications of equipment failures. "Command keeps saying the assessment is just a demonstration, but you know as well as I do that they're planning to use these results to justify operational deployments. Soldiers are going to be sent into real combat situations based on capabilities we're pretending to have." Sarah's cleaning routine took her past multiple workstations where similar conversations were taking place. The pattern was consistent throughout the motor pool. Skilled technical personnel understood exactly what was wrong with their equipment, but their concerns were being dismissed by leadership focused on maintaining the illusion of readiness. As her shift concluded, Sarah reflected on the intelligence she had gathered during her first full day of accelerated observation. The evidence was mounting that Fort Blackstone was preparing to conduct a congressional assessment under false pretenses, with soldiers potentially paying the price for institutional dishonesty. Her mission was evolving from routine intelligence gathering to something that might require more direct intervention. The Colorado night was clear and cold as she walked toward the civilian contractor quarters, her footsteps echoing softly against the concrete pathways that connected the base's various facilities. Behind her, Fort Blackstone continued its preparation for an assessment that would determine not just its future funding, but potentially the safety of the soldiers, who would be asked to demonstrate capabilities that existed primarily in administrative reports rather than operational reality. Sarah Martinez had arrived at Fort Blackstone as an invisible janitor, dismissed and overlooked by everyone from junior enlisted personnel to senior officers. But beneath the unremarkable exterior and contractor uniform was someone whose training and experience had prepared her for exactly this kind of situation. The question was whether she would be able to gather sufficient evidence to prevent disaster. Before the accelerated timeline made intervention impossible, the second week of Sarah's assignment began with an emergency maintenance call that would change everything. At 2:15 a.m., her secure pager buzzed with an urgent request to address a water leak in the classified operations center, a facility she had been systematically excluded from during her previous assignments. The timing seemed suspicious, but maintenance emergencies followed their own schedule, and her contractor credentials provided the necessary access. Building 7 stood apart from the main complex, surrounded by additional security barriers and monitored by cameras that tracked movement. With military precision, Sarah approached the entrance with her standard equipment cart, noting the unusual activity for such an early hour. 2 guards flanked the main entrance, their posture suggesting heightened alertness rather than routine duty. "Emergency maintenance," she announced, presenting her credentials to the senior guard. Corporal Jackson examined her ID with the thoroughness of someone following recently updated protocols. "Ma'am, you'll need an escort for this facility," he replied, his tone professional but firm. "Security regulations require continuous supervision of all non-cleared personnel in this building." Sarah nodded, maintaining the slightly subservient demeanor expected of civilian contractors. "Of course. I just need to locate the source of the water damage and implement temporary repairs until the regular maintenance crew can schedule permanent fixes." Corporal Jackson activated his radio, speaking in coded phrases that confirmed Sarah's growing suspicions about the facility's true purpose. Within minutes, Lieutenant Patricia Wong appeared, her uniform crisp despite the early hour and her expression carrying the alert focus of someone accustomed to handling sensitive situations. "Follow me," Wong instructed, leading Sarah through corridors lined with security doors and biometric scanners. "The leak is in the server room adjacent to the main operations center. We need it fixed immediately to prevent damage to classified equipment." The server room hummed with the constant noise of cooling systems and electronic equipment that represented millions of dollars in advanced technology. Sarah knelt beside the obvious water damage, her trained eye immediately recognizing that this wasn't a simple plumbing failure. The leak had originated from a deliberate breach in the cooling system, suggesting either sabotage or catastrophic maintenance failure. "How long has the cooling system been experiencing problems?" Sarah asked, testing the water temperature and pressure while her peripheral vision cataloged the server configurations around her. Lieutenant Wong hesitated, clearly weighing how much information to provide to a civilian contractor. "We've had intermittent issues for the past month. The system keeps overheating during high-demand operations, but the regular maintenance crew hasn't been able to identify the root cause." Sarah's specialized training had included extensive technical education, and she immediately recognized the signs of systematic failure rather than isolated incidents. The cooling system's design was adequate for normal operations, but completely insufficient for the computational demands being placed on it. Someone had either miscalculated the requirements or deliberately ignored the limitations. "These servers are running far beyond their intended capacity," she observed, noting the stress indicators on multiple displays. The cooling system was designed for standard operations, not whatever processing demands you're currently placing on it. Wong's expression tightened. "Can you fix the immediate problem or not?" Sarah began implementing emergency repairs while her mind processed the implications of what she was observing. The server room contained equipment configured for real-time tactical simulation and battlefield analysis, technology that should have been used for training exercises but appeared to be running continuously at maximum capacity. The leak repair required accessing the main cooling distribution panel, which provided Sarah with an unobstructed view of the server room's central monitoring station. Multiple displays showed tactical maps, unit positions, and environmental data that looked remarkably similar to the terrain where the congressional assessment was scheduled to take place. "Lieutenant, I need to shut down the cooling system temporarily to implement the repair," Sarah announced, her voice carrying the authority of someone who understood the technical requirements. "The servers will need to be powered down for approximately 20 minutes to prevent overheating damage." Wang immediately shook her head. "That's not possible. These systems are running critical operations that cannot be interrupted." "Then you'll have complete system failure within the next 6 hours," Sarah replied calmly, her assessment based on the temperature readings and stress indicators she had observed. "The cooling system is already operating beyond safe parameters. Without immediate shutdown and repair, you'll lose everything permanently." A heated discussion ensued between Wang and her superiors via secure communication, with Sarah maintaining her position near the cooling system while observing the server displays. The tactical information being processed was far more detailed than anything required for a simple congressional demonstration. The system was running full combat simulations with real-time environmental data and unit positioning that suggested active operational planning. The authorization for system shutdown came 20 minutes later, accompanied by additional security personnel who monitored Sarah's every movement while she worked. The repair itself was straightforward, but the intelligence gathering opportunity was unprecedented. As servers powered down in sequence, Sarah observed fragments of information that painted a disturbing picture of Fort Blackstone's true activities. Base wasn't just preparing for a congressional assessment. It was using the assessment as cover for testing actual combat deployment capabilities. The simulations running on these servers were modeling real-world scenarios with current intelligence data, suggesting that the mountain warfare exercises were intended to validate operational readiness for immediate deployment to hostile territory. Sarah's hands moved with practiced efficiency as she replaced damaged cooling components, but her mind was processing the strategic implications of what she had discovered. The equipment failures and safety concerns she had documented throughout the base weren't just administrative problems, they were potentially catastrophic vulnerabilities in systems that were being prepared for actual combat operations. The server restart sequence provided additional intelligence opportunities. As systems came back online, Sarah observed the initialization protocols that revealed the true scope of the operations being conducted. The tactical simulation software was interfacing with real-time satellite feeds, current weather data, and intelligence reports that suggested imminent deployment to mountainous terrain in Eastern Europe. "All systems are operational," she reported to Lieutenant Wang, who had remained tense throughout the repair process. "However, I need to file a comprehensive report about the cooling system's inadequate capacity. This will happen again unless the underlying design problems are addressed." Wang's response was immediate and sharp. "No reports. This was emergency maintenance that doesn't require documentation. Your work here is classified under base security protocols." The statement confirmed Sarah's suspicions about the systematic cover-up of maintenance issues. Problems weren't being addressed because acknowledging them would require admitting that the base was operating equipment beyond safe parameters. The pattern extended far beyond simple bureaucratic inefficiency. It suggested deliberate deception about operational capabilities. Her escort back to the main complex took a different route, leading Sarah through corridors she hadn't previously accessed. The path provided glimpses of additional facilities that revealed the true scope of Fort Blackstone's operations. She observed advanced communication centers, specialized training facilities, and equipment storage areas that far exceeded what would be required for routine base operations. The morning briefing room was more crowded than usual when Sarah arrived for her regular cleaning duties. The early hour hadn't prevented attendance by personnel from multiple units, their expressions reflecting the heightened tension that had characterized the base throughout her assignment. She positioned herself near the rear of the room, ostensibly organizing cleaning supplies while monitoring the discussion. Colonel Bradley stood at the podium, his bearing reflecting the stress of someone managing a complex situation under extreme pressure. Behind him, a large display showed topographical maps of the assessment area, with overlaid tactical information that provided context for the upcoming exercises. "The assessment parameters have been finalized," Bradley announced, his voice carrying. Across the silent room, congressional observers will evaluate our readiness for immediate deployment to similar terrain in operational theaters. Performance during these exercises will directly determine our unit's assignment to active combat operations. Sarah's pulse quickened as she processed the implications. The congressional assessment wasn't just a demonstration of capabilities. It was a selection process for units that would be deployed to actual combat operations. The equipment failures and safety concerns she had documented weren't just training problems. They were potentially life-threatening vulnerabilities that would accompany soldiers into hostile territory. Major Chun stepped forward to address specific operational details. The mountain warfare exercise will simulate conditions in the Carpathian Mountains, where intelligence suggests we may be deployed within the next 90 days. Environmental conditions, enemy capabilities, and logistics challenges will mirror what we expect to encounter in actual operations. The revelation transformed Sarah's understanding of the entire situation. Fort Blackstone wasn't just another training facility. It was preparing specific units for deployment to a region where American forces were apparently planning significant operations. The congressional assessment was being used to validate readiness for missions that remained classified, but were imminent enough to require immediate preparation. Captain Rodriguez raised the question that had been troubling Sarah throughout her assignment. "Sir, the equipment readiness reports still show significant deficiencies in cold weather gear and communication systems. How do we address these issues before potential deployment?" Bradley's expression hardened. "Equipment concerns are being addressed through appropriate channels. Focus on training readiness and unit cohesion rather than administrative details. The congressional observers will evaluate our performance, not our inventory." The response revealed the fundamental problem that Sarah had been documenting. Leadership was prioritizing the appearance of readiness over actual capability, with soldiers potentially paying the price for institutional dishonesty. The pattern was consistent throughout every level of the base's operations. Her cleaning routine took her past multiple conversations that provided additional context for the evolving situation. Personnel throughout the base understood that the assessment carried unusual significance, but few seemed to grasp the full implications of what was being prepared. The institutional pressure to succeed had created an environment where questioning decisions was discouraged and raising concerns was seen as disloyalty. The base's medical facility provided her next opportunity for intelligence gathering. Sarah's maintenance assignments included servicing the medical equipment and waste management systems, which granted her access to areas where medical personnel discussed their preparations for the upcoming exercises. Dr. Rachel Thompson, the base's chief medical officer, stood in the trauma bay reviewing emergency response protocols with her staff. Her expression reflected the professional concern of someone who understood the life and death implications of medical preparedness. "The evacuation procedures for the high-altitude training area are completely inadequate," she stated, gesturing toward maps showing the assessment location. "In case of serious injury, we're looking at minimum 45-minute response times under ideal conditions. In adverse weather, it could be over an hour." Major Sandra Hayes, the senior medical administrator, nodded grimly. "I've briefed command about these concerns twice. The response is always the same: focus on preventing injuries rather than planning for them. They seem to think that acknowledging evacuation challenges will somehow compromise the assessment." Sarah positioned herself near the medical equipment storage area, ostensibly checking supply levels while listening to the conversation. Her special operations background had taught her to recognize the difference between acceptable risk and negligent endangerment, and what she was hearing clearly fell into the latter category. The high-altitude medical protocols haven't been updated since 2019, Dr. Thompson continued. We're supposed to provide emergency care for conditions we haven't trained for, using equipment that hasn't been properly maintained in an environment where evacuation may be impossible. The medical personnel's concerns aligned perfectly with the equipment and training deficiencies Sarah had observed throughout the base. The pattern was consistent across all operational areas: systematic pressure to proceed with inadequate preparation while maintaining the illusion of readiness for external observers. Her afternoon assignment took her to the quartermaster facility, where she observed the final preparations for equipment distribution to units participating in the assessment. The massive warehouse buzzed with activity as personnel processed requests for specialized gear, but Sarah's trained eye immediately identified the gaps between what was being requested and what was actually available. Staff Sergeant Maria Santos supervised the distribution process, her expression reflecting the frustration of someone trying to equip soldiers with inadequate resources. The cold weather gear showed obvious signs of extended use without proper maintenance, and the communication equipment was clearly several generations behind current operational standards. We're short 40% of the high-altitude breathing apparatus, Santos reported to her supervisor, Master Sergeant Kevin Walsh. The units we have haven't been recertified since 2020, and half of them failed pressure testing last month. Walsh's response reflected the systematic pressure Sarah had observed throughout the base. Issue what we have and note the deficiencies in the after-action reports. Command has made it clear that equipment shortages won't be accepted as excuses for poor performance. The conversation continued as Sarah moved through the facility, her maintenance duties providing perfect cover for observing the equipment distribution process. The pattern was unmistakable. Soldiers were being equipped with inadequate and potentially dangerous gear, while being told that their performance would be evaluated against standards that assumed proper equipment was available. The secure communication room provided her most significant intelligence opportunity of the day. Sarah's maintenance access included the facility's electronic systems, which required her to work in areas where classified communications were being processed. The technical nature of her assignment meant that security personnel had become accustomed to her presence and had begun to treat her as invisible. Colonel Bradley stood at the secure communication console, his conversation with higher headquarters clearly audible as Sarah worked on nearby equipment. The discussion revealed the political and military pressures that were driving the entire assessment process. Sir, the congressional delegation is specifically evaluating our readiness for immediate deployment to the Carpathian Theater, Bradley reported, his voice carrying the tension of someone whose career depended on the outcome. Intelligence suggests Russian forces are increasing their presence in the region, and we may be tasked with establishing a forward operating base within 60 days. The response from higher headquarters was inaudible, but Bradley's side of the conversation provided crucial context for understanding the urgency behind the assessment. Yes, sir. We understand that unit selection for deployment depends entirely on performance during the exercises. The men and women are prepared to demonstrate our capabilities under realistic conditions. Sarah's pulse quickened as she processed the implications. The congressional assessment wasn't just a routine evaluation. It was a selection process for units that would be deployed to a region where American forces were apparently planning to establish a military presence. The equipment failures and safety concerns she had documented would accompany soldiers into a potentially hostile environment. The conversation continued with discussions of specific operational requirements and timelines that confirmed Sarah's growing understanding of the situation. Fort Blackstone was preparing for deployment to a region where American forces would be operating in close proximity to Russian military units, with the congressional assessment serving as the final validation of readiness. Her secure communication device vibrated with an encrypted message from her handler. Intelligence suggests accelerated timeline for regional deployment. Congressional assessment may be final evaluation before immediate operational assignment. Document everything. The message confirmed that higher levels of defense intelligence were monitoring the situation with increasing concern. Sarah's assignment was evolving from routine intelligence gathering to something that might require immediate intervention to prevent soldiers from being deployed with inadequate equipment and preparation. As her shift concluded, Sarah reflected on the intelligence she had gathered during her second week at Fort Blackstone. The evidence was mounting that the base was preparing to conduct a congressional assessment under false pretenses, with soldiers potentially being selected for deployment to a hostile environment based on capabilities that existed primarily in administrative reports rather than operational reality. The pattern was consistent throughout every aspect of the base's operations: systematic pressure to maintain the illusion of readiness, while ignoring fundamental problems that could prove fatal in actual combat. Equipment failures were being minimized, safety concerns were being dismissed, and personnel who raised questions were being marginalized or transferred. Sarah Martinez had arrived at Fort Blackstone as an invisible janitor, but her specialized training and experience had revealed a situation that extended far beyond simple administrative inefficiency. The base was preparing for an assessment that would determine which soldiers would be sent into harm's way, and the preparation was being conducted with systematic dishonesty about actual capabilities. The question was whether she would be able to gather sufficient evidence to prevent disaster before the accelerated timeline made intervention impossible. Her mission was evolving from intelligence gathering to something that might require direct action to protect the soldiers who were being prepared for deployment based on false information about their readiness and equipment. The third week at Fort Blackstone brought an unexpected complication that would test every aspect of Sarah's cover identity. Director Amanda Foster arrived on a Tuesday morning with a small team of Pentagon efficiency experts, ostensibly conducting a routine administrative review but clearly searching for something specific. Her presence transformed the base's atmosphere from tense preparation to barely controlled paranoia. Sarah first encountered Foster during her morning rounds in the administrative wing, where the director had commandeered a conference room for what appeared to be intensive document review. Foster stood at the center of organized chaos, surrounded by file boxes, computer terminals, and staff members who moved with the urgent precision of people working under extreme pressure. "I need complete maintenance records for all classified facilities," Foster announced to Colonel Bradley, her voice carrying the authority of someone accustomed to immediate compliance. "Personnel assignments, security clearances, equipment requisitions, everything from the past 6 months." Bradley's response was carefully measured, but Sarah detected the underlying tension. "Ma'am, those records are maintained through standard channels. I can have our administrative staff compile the requested information through proper security protocols." Foster's expression hardened. "Colonel, I'm not making a request. The Pentagon has received concerning reports about operational readiness at this facility. My team will be conducting a comprehensive review of all activities related to the upcoming congressional assessment." Sarah continued her cleaning routine while observing the exchange, her trained instincts immediately recognizing that Foster's arrival represented a significant threat to whatever cover-up was being maintained at Fort Blackstone. The director's team moved with the systematic efficiency of investigators rather than administrators, and their focus on maintenance records suggested they were looking for evidence of the very problems Sarah had been documenting. The morning briefing room buzzed with nervous energy as personnel throughout the base tried to understand the implications of the Pentagon review. Major Chun attempted to maintain normal operations, but the stress was evident in every interaction. Sarah positioned herself near the equipment storage area, ostensibly organizing supplies while monitoring the increasingly tense discussions. "The review team is specifically interested in equipment readiness reports," Chun announced to the assembled officers. "All maintenance logs, inspection records, and equipment certifications must be immediately available for examination. Any discrepancies or missing documentation will be reported directly to Pentagon oversight." Captain Rodriguez raised her hand with obvious concern. "Sir, what about the equipment deficiencies we've been documenting? The cold weather gear shortages and communication system failures have been reported through proper channels, but the issues haven't been resolved." Chun's response revealed the depth of the institutional pressure. "Focus on demonstrating what we can accomplish with available resources rather than highlighting what we lack. The review team is evaluating our operational effectiveness, not our inventory management." Sarah's secure communication device vibrated with an encrypted message from her handler. "Pentagon review team may be investigating similar concerns to your mission. Maintain cover but be prepared for potential exposure. Foster's team has access to personnel records that might reveal inconsistencies in your assignment." The warning transformed Sarah's understanding of the situation. Foster's arrival wasn't coincidental. It represented a parallel investigation that could either support her mission or compromise it entirely. The challenge was determining whether Foster's team was genuinely investigating the problems she had documented, or was part of the cover-up effort. Her afternoon assignment took her to the base's central records facility, where Foster's team had established their primary research operation. The normally quiet archive buzzed with activity as Pentagon investigators processed thousands of documents, their systematic approach revealing the scope of their investigation. Sarah entered the facility to service the air filtration systems, her maintenance cart providing perfect cover for observing the review process. The investigators were clearly looking for patterns of equipment failures, safety violations, and administrative cover-ups, exactly the issues she had been documenting during her assignment. "These maintenance logs show consistent patterns of deferred repairs and abbreviated inspections," noted Dr. James Mitchell, Foster's senior technical analyst. "The equipment being used for the congressional assessment has been operating beyond safe parameters for months." Foster studied the documentation with the focused intensity of someone building a case. The pattern suggests systematic misrepresentation of readiness levels. Units are being evaluated based on capabilities they don't actually possess. Sarah's pulse quickened as she processed the implications. Foster's team was uncovering the same evidence she had been gathering, but their investigation was proceeding through official channels that could either validate her findings or expose her cover identity. The situation was becoming increasingly complex as multiple agencies apparently investigated the same concerns. The review team's presence created new opportunities for intelligence gathering, but also increased the risk of exposure. Sarah's cover identity would undergo scrutiny if investigators examined all personnel assignments, and her specialized clearances might reveal inconsistencies that would compromise her mission. Her evening shift brought a development that changed everything. While servicing the secure communication facility, Sarah overheard a classified conversation between Colonel Bradley and General Patricia Hawkins that revealed the true scope of the situation at Fort Blackstone. "The Pentagon review team is specifically investigating reports of safety violations and equipment failures," Bradley reported, his voice carrying the stress of someone whose career was under threat. "They have access to documentation that contradicts our readiness assessments." Hawkins' response was immediate and sharp. "The congressional assessment proceeds as scheduled. Whatever the review team finds, it cannot be allowed to compromise our selection for deployment. Too much depends on Fort Blackstone being chosen for the Carpathian operation." The conversation continued with discussions of damage control and Information management that confirmed Sarah's worst suspicions. The base's leadership was prepared to proceed with the assessment, despite knowing that soldiers would be inadequately equipped and prepared for deployment to a potentially hostile environment. What about the civilian contractor who's been assigned to maintenance? Hawkins asked. Foster's team has been asking questions about personnel with unusual security clearances. Bradley's response revealed that Sarah's presence had attracted attention at the highest levels. Martinez has level 7 clearance, which is unusual for maintenance staff. Her background check shows military service, but the details are classified. She could be defense intelligence. Sarah's blood ran cold as she processed the implications. Her cover identity was being investigated by both the Pentagon review team and the base's leadership. The situation was becoming untenable as multiple parties began to suspect that she wasn't what she appeared to be. The following morning brought a direct challenge to her cover identity. Lieutenant Commander Patricia Wong approached Sarah's workstation with a formal bearing that suggested official business rather than routine interaction. Ms. Martinez, I need to discuss some discrepancies in your personnel file, Wong announced, her voice carrying the authority of someone conducting an official investigation. Your security clearance level seems unusually high for civilian maintenance staff. Sarah maintained her calm demeanor while her mind raced through possible responses. Her training had prepared her for this moment, but the timing was problematic. With the congressional assessment only days away, I held a technical position in the military before transitioning to civilian work, Sarah replied, her voice carrying the slightly defensive tone expected from someone whose background was being questioned. The clearance level reflects my previous responsibilities, not my current assignment. Wong studied her with the calculating gaze of someone trained to identify deception. Your military service record shows significant gaps in classifications that are unusual for technical personnel. What was your specific role before civilian employment? The question represented a critical moment in Sarah's mission. Revealing too much information would compromise her cover, but providing insufficient detail would increase suspicion. Her response needed to satisfy Wong's curiosity while maintaining her assumed identity. I worked in communications systems. Maintenance for special operations units, Sarah answered, staying as close to the truth as possible. The classification level reflects the sensitive nature of the equipment I maintained, not any operational role. Wong's expression suggested partial satisfaction with the response, but her investigation was clearly ongoing. The Pentagon review team has been asking about all personnel with unusual backgrounds. You may be contacted for additional questioning. The warning confirmed that Sarah's time at Fort Blackstone was becoming limited. Multiple investigations were converging on the same issues she had been documenting, but her cover identity was becoming increasingly difficult to maintain as scrutiny intensified. Her secure communication with her handler that evening revealed the full complexity of the situation. Pentagon review team is a legitimate investigation ordered by the Defense Secretary due to whistleblower reports. Foster's team is not aware of your mission, but may uncover your identity through personnel records. Consider extraction if cover becomes untenable. The message presented Sarah with a difficult choice. Her mission was nearly complete, with comprehensive evidence of the systematic problems at Fort Blackstone, but the congressional assessment was still scheduled to proceed. Extraction would preserve her cover, but abandon the soldiers who were being prepared for deployment based on false information about their readiness. The next morning brought news that transformed the entire situation. Director Foster called an emergency meeting for all senior personnel, her expression reflecting the gravity of whatever her team had discovered during their investigation. Our review has revealed systematic misrepresentation of operational readiness throughout this facility, Foster announced, her voice carrying across the silent conference room. Equipment failures have been concealed, safety violations have been ignored, and personnel concerns have been systematically dismissed. Colonel Bradley's response was carefully measured, but Sarah detected the underlying panic. "Ma'am, we've been operating under significant resource constraints while maintaining our commitment to training excellence. Any equipment issues are being addressed through proper channels." Foster's expression hardened. "Colonel, our investigation has documented equipment failure rates of over 60%, safety violations in multiple training areas, and maintenance records that have been deliberately falsified. This facility is not prepared for the congressional assessment, and it certainly isn't ready for operational deployment." The confrontation continued as Foster presented evidence that aligned perfectly with Sarah's own findings. Equipment shortages, safety concerns, and administrative cover-ups were systematically exposed through documentation that the review team had compiled independently. "The congressional assessment scheduled for this week is hereby suspended pending completion of our investigation," Foster announced, her words carrying the weight of Pentagon authority. "No units from this facility will be considered for deployment until all safety and readiness concerns have been fully addressed." The announcement created an immediate crisis for the base's leadership. General Hawkins attempted to challenge Foster's authority, but the Pentagon review team had clearly been granted significant power to override local command decisions. Sarah observed the unfolding confrontation with professional satisfaction, recognizing that Foster's investigation was achieving many of the same objectives as her own mission. The systematic problems at Fort Blackstone were being exposed through official channels, potentially preventing the deployment of inadequately prepared soldiers. However, the situation also presented new challenges for maintaining her cover identity. Foster's team would undoubtedly expand their investigation to include all personnel with unusual backgrounds, and Sarah's classified history would eventually be discovered. The afternoon brought a development that forced Sarah to reconsider her entire approach. While conducting routine maintenance in the Classified Operations Center, she overheard a secure communication between General Hawkins and her superiors at Pentagon level. "The review team's investigation threatens to expose the entire Carpathian operation," Hawkins reported, her voice carrying the stress of someone whose career was collapsing. "If Fort Blackstone is removed from deployment consideration, we'll lose our primary staging area for operations in the region." The response from higher headquarters was inaudible, but Hawkins' side of the conversation revealed the true scope of the situation. "Yes, sir. We understand that geopolitical considerations may require proceeding with deployment despite Foster's findings. The Russian buildup in the region has accelerated beyond our original timeline." Sarah's pulse quickened as she processed the implications. Even with the Pentagon review team's investigation exposing the problems at Fort Blackstone, political and military pressures might force the deployment to proceed regardless of soldier safety and equipment readiness. The conversation continued with discussions of alternative approaches and damage control strategies that suggested the institutional pressure to proceed with the Carpathian operation remained strong despite the evidence of systematic problems. Her secure communication device vibrated with an urgent message from her handler, political pressure mounting to proceed with deployment despite safety concerns. Congressional assessment may be reinstated through alternative channels. Your mission remains critical. The message confirmed that Sarah's assignment was far from complete. Foster's investigation had exposed many of the same problems she had documented, but the institutional pressure to proceed with deployment might override legitimate safety concerns. As her shift concluded, Sarah reflected on the escalating complexity of the situation at Fort Blackstone. The Pentagon review team's investigation had validated her findings about systematic problems with equipment, training, and leadership, but the political and military pressures driving the deployment remained unchanged. The congressional assessment had been suspended, but the underlying issues that had prompted her assignment persisted. Soldiers were still being prepared for deployment to a potentially hostile environment with inadequate equipment and preparation, And the institutional culture that had created these problems remained intact. Sarah Martinez had arrived at Fort Blackstone as an invisible janitor, but the convergence of multiple investigations had created a situation where her cover identity was becoming increasingly difficult to maintain. The challenge was completing her mission while avoiding exposure, particularly as the stakes continued to escalate with each passing day. The obstacles were mounting, but Sarah's training and experience had prepared her for exactly this kind of complex situation. The question was whether she could navigate the increasing scrutiny while gathering the evidence needed to prevent soldiers from being deployed under false pretenses about their readiness and capabilities. The fourth week at Fort Blackstone began with an incident that would unravel everything Sarah had worked to protect. At 0530 hours, Private First Class Michael Torres collapsed during a routine training exercise, his body seizing as hypothermia overwhelmed his inadequate cold weather gear. The medical emergency triggered a chain of events that would force Sarah to choose between maintaining her cover and preventing further casualties. Dr. Rachel Thompson worked frantically in the trauma bay as Torres' core temperature registered a dangerous 89 degrees Fahrenheit. The training exercise had been conducted in conditions that should have been manageable with proper equipment, but the defective gear Sarah had documented throughout her assignment had failed catastrophically. His gear malfunctioned completely, reported Sergeant First Class Tony Hernandez, his voice carrying the shock of someone who had witnessed a preventable tragedy. The heating elements in his jacket failed after 20 minutes, and the insulation became saturated with condensation. He was essentially exposed to sub-zero conditions with no protection. Sarah observed the medical response from her position in the adjacent corridor, her maintenance duties providing cover for monitoring the situation. Her training had taught her to recognize the difference between equipment failure and equipment negligence, and Torres' condition clearly resulted from the latter. Dr. Thompson's voice carried across the trauma bay with barely controlled anger. "This is exactly what I warned about in my medical readiness reports. We're conducting cold weather training with equipment that hasn't been properly maintained or tested. This soldier nearly died because someone decided appearances were more important than functionality." The incident created immediate ripples throughout the base's command structure. Colonel Bradley arrived at the medical facility within minutes, his expression reflecting the panic of someone whose career was suddenly in jeopardy. Behind him, Director Foster appeared with her investigation team, their presence transforming a medical emergency into a potential criminal investigation. "Doctor, I need a complete report on the equipment failure," Foster announced, her voice carrying the authority of someone who had found the smoking gun she'd been searching for. "This incident may be directly related to the systemic problems we've been documenting throughout this facility." Sarah's secure communication device vibrated with an urgent message from her handler. "Medical incident confirms your intelligence reports. Pentagon authorizing immediate intervention if necessary to prevent further casualties. Maintain cover but be prepared for emergency extraction." The message reflected the escalating seriousness of the situation. What had begun as routine intelligence gathering had evolved into a potential crisis that could claim soldiers' lives if not addressed immediately. Sarah's mission parameters were shifting from observation to potential direct intervention. The base's central command center buzzed with crisis management activity as senior officers attempted to control the damage from Torres' collapse. Sarah's maintenance assignment took her through the facility during the height of the emergency response, providing unprecedented access to high-level discussions about damage control and information management. General Patricia Hawkins stood at the center of the command post, her voice carrying the stress of someone whose entire career was under threat. "The Pentagon review team cannot be allowed to connect this incident to our overall readiness assessment. Torres' collapse was an isolated equipment failure, not systematic negligence." Major Chun's response revealed the depth of the institutional Denial. Ma'am, we can cite individual equipment malfunction rather than systematic maintenance failures. The investigation can focus on specific gear failure rather than broader policy issues. Sarah continued her work while documenting the conversation, her trained mind processing the implications of what she was hearing. The base's leadership was prepared to sacrifice Torres' well-being to maintain the illusion of operational readiness, treating his near-death experience as a public relations problem rather than a symptom of systematic negligence. The afternoon brought a development that would test every aspect of Sarah's training and judgment. While conducting maintenance in the Classified Operations Center, she discovered that the congressional assessment had been quietly rescheduled despite Director Foster's suspension order. The exercise would proceed under alternative authorization, bypassing the Pentagon review team's authority through administrative maneuvering. The tactical displays showed updated timelines and participant lists, with units from Fort Blackstone still scheduled for evaluation despite the documented equipment failures and safety violations. The political and military pressures driving the deployment to the Carpathian region had apparently overcome legitimate safety concerns. Sarah's pulse quickened as she processed the implications. Soldiers would be evaluated for deployment using the same inadequate equipment that had nearly killed Torres, and the institutional pressure to succeed would prevent honest assessment of their actual capabilities. The congressional assessment would proceed as a predetermined outcome rather than genuine evaluation. Her secure communication to her handler was brief but urgent. Congressional assessment rescheduled through alternative channels. Equipment failures ignored. Soldiers at immediate risk. Request authorization for direct intervention. The response came within minutes. Authorization granted for necessary action to prevent casualties. Maintain operational security, but protect soldiers by any means required. The message represented a fundamental shift in Sarah's mission parameters. She was no longer simply gathering intelligence about potential problems. She was authorized to take direct action to prevent soldiers from being placed in life-threatening situations based on false information about their equipment and training. The evening shift brought an opportunity that would define the entire mission. While servicing the secure communication facility, Sarah overheard a classified conversation between General Hawkins and Defense Secretary Morrison that revealed the true scope of the political pressures driving the Fort Blackstone assessment. Mr. Secretary, the Pentagon review team has identified systematic problems with our readiness assessment, Hawkins reported, her voice carrying the stress of someone delivering bad news to powerful officials. Equipment failures, safety violations, and maintenance deficiencies that directly contradict our operational claims. Morrison's response was inaudible, but Hawkins' side of the conversation revealed the political calculations that were overriding military judgment. Yes, sir. We understand that geopolitical considerations require proceeding with deployment despite safety concerns. The Russian buildup in Eastern Europe has created a timeline that doesn't allow for complete equipment replacement. The conversation continued with discussions of acceptable casualty rates and political risk assessment that treated soldiers' lives as acceptable losses in pursuit of strategic objectives. Sarah's training had prepared her for the moral complexity of military operations, but the casual acceptance of preventable casualties represented a fundamental violation of military ethics. The congressional assessment will proceed as scheduled, Hawkins continued. Units will be evaluated based on their performance with available equipment, and deployment decisions will be made accordingly. Foster's investigation will be managed through appropriate channels. Sarah's secure communication device vibrated. With another message from her handler, political pressure confirmed at highest levels. Congressional assessment proceeding despite safety concerns. Your intervention may be the only way to prevent casualties. The message confirmed that Sarah's assignment had evolved beyond intelligence gathering to direct action. The institutional pressure to proceed with deployment, despite documented safety problems, meant that soldiers would be placed in life-threatening situations unless someone with the authority and capability to intervene took action. The following morning brought a direct challenge that would test every aspect of Sarah's cover identity and operational training. Director Foster's investigation team had identified her as a person of interest, and Lieutenant Commander Wong approached her workstation with backup security personnel. "Ms. Martinez, I need you to come with me for additional questioning," Wong announced, her voice carrying the authority of someone conducting a formal investigation. "The Pentagon review team has questions about your background and your presence at this facility." Sarah's training had prepared her for this moment, but the timing was critical with the congressional assessment only hours away. Her response needed to balance maintaining her cover with positioning herself to intervene in the upcoming evaluation. "Of course," Sarah replied, maintaining the slightly concerned demeanor expected from a civilian contractor whose background was being questioned. "I'm happy to clarify any confusion about my assignment here." The interrogation room was standard military design, with recording equipment and formal seating arrangements that reflected the seriousness of the investigation. Director Foster sat across from Sarah, her expression carrying the focused intensity of someone who had identified a key piece of her investigation. "Ms. Martinez, your personnel file contains significant inconsistencies that suggest you may not be what you appear to be," Foster began, her voice carrying the authority of someone accustomed to uncovering deception. "Your security clearance level, your military background, and your assignment to this facility don't align with civilian maintenance work." Sarah's response was carefully calculated to provide enough information to satisfy Foster's concerns while maintaining her operational flexibility. "Director, I served in military communications systems for 12 years before transitioning to civilian work. My clearance level reflects my previous responsibilities, and my assignment here involves maintaining classified equipment that requires that level of access." Foster studied her with the calculating gaze of someone trained to identify deception. "Your military service record shows classifications that are unusual for technical personnel. What was your specific role before civilian employment?" The question represented a critical moment in Sarah's mission. Revealing her true background would compromise her cover, but might also provide the credibility needed to stop the congressional assessment. Her response would determine whether she could continue operating undercover or would be forced to reveal her identity. "I worked in communication systems maintenance for special operations units," Sarah answered, staying as close to the truth as possible while maintaining her assumed identity. "The classification level reflects the sensitive nature of the equipment I maintained, not any operational role." Foster's expression suggested partial satisfaction with the response, but her investigation was clearly ongoing. "The systematic problems we've documented at this facility suggest possible sabotage or deliberate intelligence gathering. Your presence here during our investigation is suspicious." The accusation forced Sarah to reconsider her entire approach. Foster's investigation had uncovered the same problems she had been documenting, but the Pentagon review team was apparently considering the possibility that an outside agent was responsible for the systematic failures. "Director, I've been conducting routine maintenance on equipment that was already failing when I arrived," Sarah replied, her voice carrying the defensive tone expected from someone whose professional competence was being questioned. "The problems you've documented existed long before my assignment here." The interrogation continued for over an hour, with Foster's team systematically examining every aspect of Sarah's background and assignment. The questions revealed the scope of their investigation and their growing suspicion that she represented more than a simple maintenance contractor. The session concluded with Foster's team apparently satisfied that Sarah wasn't responsible for the systematic problems they had documented, but her identity remained under investigation. The timing was critical, with the congressional assessment scheduled to begin in less than 6 hours. Sarah's secure communication to her handler was brief but urgent. Cover identity under investigation, but holding. Congressional assessment proceeding despite safety concerns. Request immediate guidance on intervention protocols. The response came within minutes. Pentagon review team's investigation validates your findings, but political pressure. Overriding safety concerns. Authorization granted for direct intervention to prevent casualties. Reveal identity if necessary. To protect soldiers. The message represented the final authorization Sarah needed to abandon her cover identity and take direct action to prevent the congressional assessment from proceeding with inadequate equipment and preparation. Her mission was evolving from intelligence gathering to direct intervention in military operations. The evening brought preparation for what would be the most challenging aspect of her entire assignment. The congressional assessment would begin. At dawn, with units from Fort Blackstone demonstrating their readiness for deployment using the same inadequate equipment that had nearly killed Torres. The institutional pressure to succeed would prevent honest assessment of actual capabilities. Sarah's final maintenance rounds took her through the equipment storage areas, where soldiers were preparing for the assessment. The cold weather gear showed the same defects she had documented throughout her assignment, and the communication equipment remained several generations behind operational standards. Staff Sergeant Maria Santos supervised the final equipment distribution, her expression reflecting the resignation of someone who understood the problems but lacked the authority to address them. Issue what we have and hope for the best, she instructed her team, her voice carrying the fatalism of someone who had given up fighting the system. Sarah observed the preparation with growing determination. Her training and experience had prepared her for exactly this kind of situation, where institutional pressure created conditions that would claim soldiers' lives unless someone with the authority and capability to intervene took action. The congressional delegation would arrive at dawn, expecting to observe a demonstration of military readiness that would justify deployment to a potentially hostile environment. Instead, they would witness either a carefully orchestrated deception or a catastrophic failure that would expose the systematic problems at Fort Blackstone. Sarah Martinez had arrived at Fort Blackstone as an invisible janitor, but the evolution of her mission had brought her to a point where maintaining that cover identity might cost soldiers their lives. The question was whether she could reveal her true identity and intervene in the assessment without compromising the broader intelligence operation that had brought her here. The confrontation was approaching, and Sarah's training had prepared her for the moment when operational security would have to be balanced against immediate threats to American soldiers. The choice between maintaining her cover and preventing casualties would define not just her mission, but potentially the lives of the soldiers who trusted their leadership to provide adequate equipment and honest assessment of their capabilities. Dawn broke over Fort Blackstone with the kind of crystalline clarity that would have been perfect for a legitimate military assessment. Instead, Sarah Martinez watched from the maintenance building as 3 black SUVs arrived at the main gate, carrying the congressional delegation that would unknowingly participate in what she now understood was an elaborate deception designed to mask systematic failures that had already nearly claimed one soldier's life. The delegation emerged with the confident bearing of political leaders, expecting to witness American military excellence. Senator Rebecca Walsh led the group, her reputation for military advocacy making her the perfect choice to validate Fort Blackstone's readiness claims. Behind her, Representative Thomas Kane and Defense Appropriations Committee Chair Margaret Stevens moved with the purposeful stride of people accustomed to wielding significant influence over military policy. Sarah's maintenance cart provided perfect cover as she positioned herself near the VIP reception area, ostensibly checking ventilation systems while observing the carefully orchestrated welcome ceremony. General Hawkins stood at attention in her dress uniform, every detail calculated to project competence and readiness. Despite the systematic problems that Sarah had documented throughout her assignment. "Welcome to Fort Blackstone," Hawkins announced, her voice carrying the confidence of someone who had spent weeks preparing for this moment. "Today's assessment will demonstrate our soldiers' readiness for immediate deployment to any theater of operations, particularly in challenging mountain warfare environments." The statement was carefully crafted to avoid specific commitments while creating the impression of complete operational readiness. Sarah's training had taught her to recognize the difference between confident leadership and institutional deception, and Hawkins' presentation clearly fell into the latter category. The morning briefing took place in the base's premier conference facility, where large displays showed topographical maps of the assessment area and detailed technical specifications for the equipment that would be demonstrated. Sarah entered to service the audiovisual systems, her presence so routine that conversations continued around her as if she were invisible. Colonel Bradley stood at the podium, gesturing toward tactical displays that bore little resemblance to the actual conditions Sarah had observed during her assignment. "Our soldiers will demonstrate advanced mountain warfare capabilities, using state-of-the-art equipment designed for extreme environmental conditions." Senator Walsh leaned forward with obvious interest. "Colonel, what specific technologies will be demonstrated today?" "The Defense Appropriations Committee is particularly interested in how new equipment performs under realistic conditions." Bradley's response was a masterpiece of technical misdirection. "Ma'am, today's assessment will showcase integrated communication systems, advanced cold weather protection, and tactical mobility equipment that represents the cutting edge of military technology." Sarah continued her work while mentally cataloging the discrepancies between Bradley's presentation and the reality she had documented. The communication systems were outdated, the cold weather gear was defective, and the tactical equipment showed clear signs of inadequate maintenance. The congressional delegation was being systematically misled about the capabilities they would observe. Representative Kane asked the question that went to the heart of Sarah's concerns. "Colonel, how confident are you that the units demonstrated today are ready for immediate deployment to similar environments overseas?" The question created a moment of tension that Sarah could feel throughout the room. Bradley's response would either acknowledge the systematic problems she had documented or perpetuate the deception that could cost soldiers their lives. "Sir, the units you'll observe today represent the highest standard of military readiness," Bradley replied, his voice carrying the authority of someone whose career depended on the answer. "They are prepared for immediate deployment to any operational theater where their capabilities are required." The statement was a direct lie, and Sarah's training had prepared her to recognize the moment when institutional deception crossed the line into potential criminal negligence. The congressional delegation was being asked to authorize deployment based on false information about soldier readiness and equipment capability. Her secure communication device vibrated with an encrypted message from her handler. Congressional delegation being systematically misled about actual capabilities. Authorization confirmed for immediate intervention to prevent deployment based on false information. The message represented the final authorization. Sarah needed to abandon her cover identity and take direct action. The institutional pressure to maintain the deception had reached a point where political considerations were overriding fundamental military ethics and soldier safety. The equipment demonstration began with fanfare that would have been impressive if it had been honest. Soldiers in full combat gear moved through tactical scenarios designed to showcase their readiness for deployment. But Sarah's trained eye immediately identified the careful staging that concealed systematic problems. The cold weather gear appeared functional from a distance, but Sarah knew from her documentation that the heating elements were unreliable and the insulation was inadequate for extended operations. The communication equipment transmitted clearly during the demonstration, But she had observed multiple system failures during routine training exercises. Most concerning was the tactical mobility equipment, which appeared to function perfectly during the carefully controlled demonstration, but had shown consistent problems during actual training exercises. The congressional delegation was observing a performance designed to create false impressions about operational capabilities. Captain Rodriguez led her unit through a complex mountain warfare scenario, her professional competence evident in every movement. The soldiers executed their assignments with precision that reflected excellent training. But Sarah understood that their performance was being used to validate equipment that would fail them in actual combat conditions. The demonstration reached its climax as Rodriguez's unit executed a tactical communication exercise that required coordination between multiple positions in challenging terrain. The system functioned flawlessly during the brief demonstration, but Sarah had documented multiple failures of the same equipment during extended training exercises. Senator Walsh observed the demonstration with obvious approval. This is exactly the kind of capability we need for modern warfare. These soldiers appear ready for any challenge they might face in operational deployment. The comment represented the moment when Sarah's mission reached its crisis point. The congressional delegation was being asked to authorize deployment based on a carefully orchestrated deception that would place soldiers in life-threatening situations with inadequate equipment and false expectations about their capabilities. Her training had prepared her for exactly this kind of situation, where institutional pressure created conditions that would claim American lives unless someone with the authority and capability to intervene took action. The choice between maintaining operational security and preventing casualties had become clear. Sarah's movement toward the demonstration area was deliberate and calculated. Her maintenance cart provided cover as she approached the tactical command post where the congressional delegation observed the exercise. The moment had arrived to abandon her cover identity and reveal the systematic deception that threatened soldier safety. The confrontation began when Sarah positioned herself directly in the line of sight between the congressional delegation and the tactical display. Her movement was subtle but deliberate, designed to attract attention without creating immediate alarm. "Excuse me, Senator." Walsh addressed her with the polite dismissal typically reserved for support staff. "Could you please move your equipment? We're trying to observe the tactical demonstration." Sarah's response was carefully calculated to create maximum impact while maintaining professional bearing. "Ma'am, I need to inform you that the demonstration you're observing doesn't accurately represent the actual capabilities of this equipment." The statement created immediate tension throughout the command post. General Hawkins moved toward Sarah with obvious alarm, while the congressional delegation exchanged confused glances. The carefully orchestrated demonstration was being challenged by someone they had dismissed as irrelevant maintenance staff. "Ms. Martinez, return to your assigned duties immediately," Hawkins ordered, her voice carrying the authority of someone accustomed to immediate compliance. The congressional delegation doesn't need to be disturbed by maintenance concerns. Sarah's response marked the moment when her cover identity was abandoned in favor of her true mission. "General, the congressional delegation needs to understand that the equipment being demonstrated today has documented failure rates that make it unsuitable for operational deployment." The confrontation escalated as Colonel Bradley approached with security personnel, their presence designed to remove Sarah from the demonstration area before she could provide additional information to the congressional delegation. "Ma'am, you're interfering with official military operations," Bradley announced, his voice carrying the threat of immediate arrest. "Security will escort you from this area." Sarah's training had prepared her for this moment, when operational security would have to be balanced against immediate threats to American soldiers. Her response would determine whether the congressional delegation received accurate information about the capabilities they were evaluating. "Colonel, I'm not interfering with military operations," Sarah replied, her voice carrying an authority that hadn't been present during her weeks as maintenance staff. "I'm preventing the congressional delegation from being misled about the actual readiness of these units." The statement created immediate recognition among the military personnel present that Sarah wasn't what she appeared to be. Her bearing, her vocabulary, and her willingness to challenge senior officers suggested training and authority that exceeded civilian maintenance work. Senator Walsh stepped forward with obvious interest. "Ma'am, what exactly are you trying to tell us about this equipment?" The question represented the opportunity Sarah had been working toward throughout her assignment. The congressional delegation was finally being given access to information that contradicted the carefully orchestrated presentation they had been receiving. "Senator, the cold weather gear being demonstrated today has documented failure rates exceeding 60%. Sarah replied, her voice carrying the authority of someone providing official testimony. "The communication systems show multiple failures during extended operations, and the tactical mobility equipment has been maintained below acceptable standards." The information created immediate concern among the congressional delegation, while the military leadership responded with barely controlled panic. The systematic deception that had been maintained for weeks was being exposed by someone whose background and authority remained unclear. Representative Kane asked the critical question, "Who are you, and how do you have access to this information?" Sarah's response marked the moment when her true identity was revealed to achieve her mission objectives. She pulled back the sleeve of her maintenance uniform, exposing the distinctive tattoo that had been hidden throughout her assignment at Fort Blackstone. The tattoo was immediately recognizable to anyone with military experience. The eagle, anchor, and trident of the Navy SEALs, surrounded by tactical imagery that indicated Special Operations Service. But it was the small details that revealed the true significance: the gold stars indicating combat deployments, the specialized unit designation, and the service dates that confirmed extensive operational experience. "I'm Commander Sarah Martinez, Defense Intelligence Agency," she announced, her voice carrying the authority that had been concealed throughout her assignment. "I've been conducting an investigation into the systematic misrepresentation of operational readiness at this facility." The revelation created immediate shock throughout the command post. The invisible janitor that had been dismissed and ignored by everyone from junior enlisted personnel to senior officers was actually a decorated Special Operations veteran conducting an official investigation. Senator Walsh's response reflected the gravity of the situation. "Commander, are you telling us that this entire demonstration is false?" Sarah's answer was delivered with the precision of someone providing official testimony to Congress. "Senator, the equipment being demonstrated today cannot perform reliably under operational conditions. The soldiers are exceptionally well trained, but they're being prepared for deployment with inadequate equipment and false expectations about their capabilities." The statement created an immediate crisis for the military leadership, while the congressional delegation began to understand that they had been systematically misled about the readiness assessment they were observing. General Hawkins attempted to challenge Sarah's authority, but her revealed identity had fundamentally changed the power dynamic. "Commander, you're exceeding your authority by interfering with official military operations." Sarah's response carried the weight of her actual rank and specialized training. "General, I'm operating under direct authorization from Defense Intelligence to investigate systematic misrepresentation of operational readiness. The congressional delegation has the right to accurate information about the capabilities they're evaluating." The confrontation continued as Sarah provided specific examples of the equipment failures and safety violations she had documented throughout her assignment. The congressional delegation listened with growing alarm as the scope of the deception became clear. The demonstration ground to a halt as the implications of Sarah's revelation settled over the assembled officials. The carefully orchestrated assessment had been exposed as an elaborate Attempt to deceive congressional oversight about the actual readiness of military units being prepared for deployment. Senator Walsh made the decision that validated Sarah's entire mission. General Hawkins, this assessment is hereby suspended, pending a complete investigation into the allegations that have been presented. No deployment decisions will be made based on today's demonstration. The statement represented the successful conclusion of Sarah's intelligence-gathering mission, but it also marked the beginning of a comprehensive investigation that would transform military oversight procedures throughout the Department of Defense. As security personnel moved to secure the demonstration area, Sarah reflected on the journey that had brought her to this moment. She had arrived at Fort Blackstone as an invisible janitor, dismissed and underestimated by everyone who encountered her. The revelation of her true identity had stopped not just the congressional assessment, but the entire systematic deception that had threatened soldier safety. The Navy SEAL tattoo that had been hidden throughout her assignment was now visible to everyone present, serving as undeniable proof of her qualifications to challenge the institutional deception that had been maintained at Fort Blackstone. The demonstration had been stopped, but the broader investigation into military readiness assessment would continue long after her assignment concluded. The aftermath of Sarah's revelation transformed Fort Blackstone from a carefully controlled military installation into the center of the most comprehensive investigation in modern Defense Department history. Within hours of the suspended congressional assessment, teams of investigators from multiple agencies descended upon the base, their presence marking the end of the institutional deception that had threatened soldier safety for months. Senator Walsh stood in the base's main conference room, her expression reflecting the gravity of someone who had witnessed systematic betrayal of congressional trust. The revelation that she had been deliberately misled about military readiness had triggered immediate action at the highest levels of government. Commander Martinez, your intervention today may have prevented a disaster that would have cost American lives, Walsh addressed Sarah, who now stood before the congressional delegation in her proper uniform, her Navy SEAL insignia visible and her authority unquestioned. The systematic deception you've exposed represents a fundamental violation of military ethics and congressional oversight. Sarah's response carried the measured professionalism that had characterized her entire military career. Senator, the soldiers at Fort Blackstone are exceptional warriors who deserve honest assessment of their capabilities and adequate equipment for their missions. The institutional pressure to maintain false appearances was placing them at unacceptable risk. The investigation that followed moved with unprecedented speed and thoroughness. Director Foster's Pentagon Review Team, now working in coordination with Sarah's defense intelligence findings, had compiled evidence that painted a damning picture of systematic misrepresentation throughout the military's readiness assessment process. General Hawkins stood before a hastily convened military tribunal, her career effectively ended by the exposure of her role in the deception. The evidence presented included maintenance records that had been falsified, safety reports that had been suppressed, and communication transcripts that documented deliberate decisions to ignore equipment failures. The evidence shows systematic pressure to maintain false readiness assessments despite documented safety concerns, announced Colonel Patricia Adams, the military prosecutor assigned to the case. General Hawkins and her staff prioritized political considerations over soldier safety, creating conditions that directly endangered American military personnel. The tribunal proceedings revealed the full scope of the institutional pressure that had created the conditions Sarah had investigated. Political timelines, funding considerations, and career advancement had combined to create an environment where honest assessment of military capabilities was seen as disloyalty rather than professional responsibility. Sarah testified before the tribunal with the same precision she had demonstrated throughout her undercover assignment. Her detailed documentation of equipment failures, safety violations, and administrative cover-ups provided the foundation for criminal charges that would transform military oversight procedures. The systematic problems at Fort Blackstone weren't isolated incidents, Sarah explained to the tribunal. They represented institutional culture that valued appearance over substance, with potentially fatal consequences for the soldiers who trusted their leadership to provide accurate information about their capabilities. The investigation expanded beyond Fort Blackstone as similar patterns were discovered at installations throughout the military. Sarah's methodology for identifying systematic deception became the template for comprehensive reviews that revealed problems across multiple branches of service. Captain Rodriguez testified about the pressure she had faced to ignore equipment deficiencies while maintaining the appearance of unit readiness. Her testimony illustrated how institutional pressure had filtered down to junior officers, creating impossible situations where honesty about capabilities was discouraged. Commander Martinez's intervention saved my soldiers from being deployed with equipment that would have failed under operational conditions, Rodriguez stated, her voice carrying the emotion of someone who had witnessed near disaster. The systematic deception at this facility was placing exceptional warriors in situations where they couldn't succeed regardless of their skill and dedication. The medical testimony provided by Dr. Thompson revealed the full scope of the safety violations that had characterized Fort Blackstone's operations. Private Torres' collapse during training was presented as evidence of the systematic negligence that had permeated the base's leadership. The medical emergencies we documented were preventable, Dr. Thompson testified. The equipment failures that caused these incidents were known to leadership, but ignored in favor of maintaining the appearance of operational readiness. The equipment analysis conducted by independent technical experts validated every aspect of Sarah's intelligence gathering. The systematic failures she had documented were confirmed through comprehensive testing that revealed problems far beyond what had been officially acknowledged. Staff Sergeant Santos testified about the pressure she had faced to distribute defective equipment while maintaining false inventory reports. Her testimony illustrated how the institutional deception had required participation from personnel at every level of the base's operations. We knew the equipment was inadequate, but questioning it was seen as a lack of commitment to the mission. Santos explained, Commander Martinez's investigation revealed that our concerns were justified and that soldier safety was being compromised by administrative pressure. The congressional hearings that followed drew national attention to the systematic problems that Sarah's investigation had exposed. The Defense Appropriations Committee conducted public hearings that revealed how political pressure had corrupted military readiness assessment throughout the Department of Defense. Senator Walsh's opening statement reflected the gravity of the Gumvas situation. The systematic deception exposed at Fort Blackstone represents a fundamental betrayal of congressional trust and American military values. The investigation conducted by Commander Martinez has revealed problems that extend far beyond a single installation. The hearings revealed how political timelines and funding considerations had created institutional pressure to maintain false readiness assessments. The Carpathian deployment that had driven the assessment schedule was postponed indefinitely. While comprehensive equipment replacement and training restructuring were implemented, Representative Kane's questioning focused on the systematic nature of the problems that Sarah had documented. Commander Martinez, how widespread are the issues you discovered at Fort Blackstone? Sarah's response was delivered with the precision of someone providing official testimony to Congress. Sir, the problems at Fort Blackstone appear to be symptomatic of broader institutional issues throughout the military. The pressure to maintain false readiness assessments exists wherever political considerations override military judgment. The Department of Defense response was swift and comprehensive. Secretary Morrison announced immediate implementation of new oversight procedures. That would prevent the kind of systematic deception that Sarah had exposed. The investigation conducted by Commander Martinez has identified fundamental flaws in our readiness assessment process, Morrison announced. We are implementing immediate reforms that will ensure honest evaluation of military capabilities and adequate equipment for our soldiers. The reforms included independent oversight of equipment testing, mandatory reporting of safety violations, and protection for personnel who raised concerns about readiness issues. The changes were designed to create institutional culture that valued honesty over appearance and soldier safety over political convenience. Sarah's role in the investigation earned her recognition that extended far beyond military circles. Her methodology for identifying systematic deception became the standard for intelligence operations aimed at protecting American military personnel from institutional negligence. The Navy SEAL community responded to Sarah's actions with the kind of respect reserved for warriors who had demonstrated exceptional courage under extreme pressure. Her willingness to abandon operational security to protect soldiers embodied the values that defined Special Operations Service. Admiral Catherine Stevens, the Navy's senior Special Operations Commander, presented Sarah with a commendation that recognized her unique contribution to military ethics and soldier safety. Commander Martinez demonstrated the kind of moral courage that defines the best of American military service. Her actions prevented a tragedy that would have cost American lives. The transformation of Fort Blackstone proceeded with the systematic thoroughness that characterized Sarah's investigation. New leadership was installed, equipment was replaced, and training procedures were completely restructured to ensure honest assessment of capabilities and limitations. Colonel Bradley faced criminal charges for his role in the systematic deception, while the junior officers who had been pressured to maintain false readiness assessments received counseling and retraining. The institutional culture that had created the dangerous conditions was systematically dismantled and replaced. The soldiers who had been prepared for deployment with inadequate equipment were retrained with honest assessment of their capabilities and proper equipment for their missions. The exceptional warriors who had been placed at risk by institutional deception were finally provided with the support they deserved. Captain Rodriguez was promoted and assigned to lead the reform training program at Fort Blackstone. Her experience with the systematic pressure to maintain false readiness made her ideally suited to create institutional culture that valued honesty over appearance. Private Torres recovered completely from his hypothermia incident and became an uncommon advocate for equipment safety throughout the military. His near-death experience served as a powerful reminder of the consequences when institutional pressure overrides soldier safety. The broader military community responded to Sarah's investigation with comprehensive reforms that extended far beyond Fort Blackstone. The systematic problems she had exposed were addressed through policy changes, personnel reassignments, and institutional restructuring that transformed military readiness assessment. The intelligence community recognized Sarah's methodology as a breakthrough in identifying systematic deception within large organizations. Her approach to undercover investigation became the template for operations aimed at protecting American interests from institutional corruption. 6 months after the Procura congressional assessment, Sarah stood before the graduating class at the Naval Academy, her uniform bearing the decorations that reflected her exceptional service. The story of her investigation had become a case study in military ethics and the importance of moral courage in protecting American soldiers. The most dangerous enemy isn't the one you face on the battlefield, Sarah told the assembled cadets. It's the institutional pressure that asks you to compromise your integrity and the safety of the people you've sworn to protect. Your greatest weapon isn't your training or your equipment. It's your commitment to truth regardless of the personal cost. The investigation that had begun with Sarah's assignment to Fort Blackstone had transformed military oversight throughout the Department of Defense. The systematic deception that had threatened soldier safety was replaced with institutional culture that valued honesty, transparency, and the fundamental military principle that soldiers' lives were sacred trusts that could never be compromised for political convenience. As Sarah concluded her address to the Naval Academy, she reflected on the journey that had brought her from an invisible janitor to someone whose actions had stopped an entire military base and transformed institutional culture throughout the Department of Defense. The Navy SEAL tattoo that had been hidden throughout her assignment was now visible to all, serving as a reminder that sometimes the most powerful act of service is having the courage to stand up for what's right when everyone else chooses silence. Soldiers who had been saved by her intervention would never know how close they had come to disaster, but they would benefit from the institutional reforms that had grown from her investigation. That knowledge was enough for Sarah Martinez, whose greatest mission hadn't been conducted in hostile territory, but in the corridors of her own military, where the enemy was complacent and the victory was measured in lives saved rather than battles. 1. The investigation was complete, the deception exposed, and the soldiers protected. Sometimes the most important battles are fought not against foreign enemies, but against the institutional failures that threaten the very people we've sworn to defend. Sarah Martinez had fought that battle and won, not with weapons or tactics, but with the simple courage to tell the truth when everyone else chose to remain silent. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hits the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out. And don't forget to subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss any upload from us.